Hello, I'm Sally Wiener Grotta, and this is What If, Why Not, How? Where I ask people who have interesting stories and ideas questions that are on my mind. My guest today is Yerra Sugarman. I met Yerra last month at the AWP conference. That's the Association of Writers and Writers Program conference. And at the conference, I heard Yerra read some of her poetry. And I just knew I had to learn more about the woman behind such poignant and moving words. And here she is now. I'm thrilled with that. In addition to having her poetry, essays, and critical articles published in, I don't know how many journals, Yerra is the author of 3 poetry collections, Ant Bird, The Bag of Broken Glass, and Forms of Gone. I love all 3 names. They're great. These books have received numerous honors. I can't read all of them, but let's see. American Book Fest 2022 Best Book Award for General Poetry, PEN American Center's Joyce Osterweil Award for Poetry, the Poetry Society of America's George Bogin and Cecil Hemley Memorial Awards, and Discovery, the National Poetry Award. She's also a National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, which is, I'm very impressed by that always. Yerra has also been a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, as well as for the New England Poetry Club's Motion Book Prize. So many more honors. You'll have to check out her website. Welcome, Yerra. I'm delighted you could join me today.
Well, hello, Sally. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. I'm honored.
To start off, could you read just a bit of your poetry? Tell us what you are reading and then read it for us.
Absolutely. Thank you again. And I'd like to start by reading from my latest book called Ant Bird. And I know you're going to post probably the cover, Sally. And the book was published by Four Way Books in 2022. It is a book in which I come to terms with the murder of my aunt, Fega. Fega means bird in Yiddish.
Yes.
And what the murder, though, by the Nazis in 1942, Fega died in Poland, in the Krakow ghetto that was run by the Nazis. So basically, just so everyone knows, I knew next to nothing about her. My mother, who was a Holocaust survivor, both my parents were, they didn't talk very much about our families who had perished or who were killed during the Shoah. But I knew a little bit about my aunt. Very little bit. And then one day in 2006, the internet being the miracle it can be, it can also be not great, but if we learn to use technology for good, for the good of humankind, we can really make great use of it. And I found documentation about my aunt, Fega. There was documentation in a few of the Holocaust Museum databases, including a form she had filled out by Nazi order.
Wow.
And so, around that time, I started writing about her, and it became gradually, the book is kind of one long poem in one way, although I think the poems hopefully stand on their own as individual works. And it's sort of a book of mourning in verse, an elegy, really in book length elegy. I'll start. Does that make sense? I hope
yes. Yes.
So I do want to say that there's some documentation in the book, but a lot of it is based on the very small amount my mother told me, and on my imagination. I had to come to terms with the fact that I was appropriating an experience I could not know anything about. But I decided that it was more important for my aunt to be known and have a voice than my arguing with myself about the ethics of appropriating that voice, even though, of course, how could I know that degree of suffering? Yes. So I'll start with a poem in which, so there's a combination of, it's very based on my imagination, on a bit of surrealism, imagery, imagistic poetry, and what I knew about her. And she became a teacher in the late 1930s in Krakow, where she later was she was moved into the ghetto where the Jews were moved, and died there. And the first poem I'll read is called "She Lived Amid the Tumult of an Occupied City." And of course, the Nazis occupied Poland and Krakow. So here we go. The war thrust its hand inside her. It churned her belly and her heart. And she lived amid the tumult of an occupied city, a donkey led by its bridle, surrounded by the enemy, laughing about the names it had for Jew. She asked herself how many ways she could say madness, and watched soldiers round up those whose fingers danced on the words of the Torah. Those who sat under a cafe's awning, stirring a cup of tea, were also rounded up. Those bargaining for beets piled high in the market. Those hanging wet sheets over balcony railings were dragged from their apartments, and those stopped to show identity cards where peddlers sold bright balloons were hauled away under the sharp beams of street lamps. Walls were peppered with gunfire, bluebells speckled red. Her people reeled along cobbled streets, each person clutching a sack containing things the enemy let them keep. She was a short breath of a girl who nursed an Oreo that sipped in the mustard glow of a Sabbath afternoon, the crimson from poppies. A girl who blamed herself for kissing a boy beneath a tangerine moon and for believing in anything that didn't rust. Resistance, revolt, joy sometimes, and songs not exiled from the spirit. To hell with the enemy, she trilled in Yiddish, her nostrils widening, her voice tugging the air. And for singing, she blamed herself also, scolded herself in a language rising from her lips like steam.
Wow. That's chilling, haunting, and exquisite. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, thank you for letting me read it.
Oh my goodness. Now, you told us the origin story of Aunt Bird, which sounds like a very incredibly difficult thing for you to have written. Is it a deviation from the other two poetry collections, or is there a common thread among all three? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Sally. There is, it's different in style and form, because it is about it addresses my aunt's experience. Either I'm speaking for her, I'm speaking to her, she's speaking to me. So in that way, it's different, and in that it can be read as one long poem almost. The other two, and so it's dealing with my aunt who was killed during the Holocaust, during the Shoah, as it's known in Hebrew. The other two books do also deal with issues that address my growing up among Holocaust survivors. Mm-hmm. So the Holocaust is in all the books. The first book is especially, I think, focused on my upbringing among a community of survivors in Toronto, a very tight-knit community. And then in that first book, there is one poem about my aunt Vega, my Aunt Bird, because there's one photograph, I can always send it to you, of her, that I only have one photograph of her, and that got my imagination really stimulated. when I was a kid, I saw this one photograph. So the common thread would be living among Holocaust survivors.
Right. Yeah. Has your perception of that experience changed as you've written one, then two, then three poetry collections?
Yes, and that's a great question. I mean, yes, of course, it definitely has evolved. And the first book was more centered, well, it was centered mostly around my family. I guess I guess all the books another thread is the fact that I do talk a lot about my family. The second book branches out a little more, and it deals a little more with some other traumas and biblical stories, sort of midrashes from
Yes.
about different Bible stories, like mostly I think from Genesis.
If I could just interrupt, midrash is simply interpretation of biblical passages that are done by individuals or groups.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think so. Yeah, I have. Of course, my knowledge base increased, and I went to Krakow, and I read I've read more. So with time, it changed from having a sort of light awareness of what it means to me and maybe to some other writers to represent the Holocaust. And then with time, it evolved into almost like more questions that I asked.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're trained as Jews to always be asking questions. We never really fully find answers, do we? We're always asking questions.
Exactly.
I think it's the quality of the questions that we ask that define how we live and
That's lovely.
who we are.
Yeah, that's so lovely.
So I was going to go in another direction, but there was a question I had in mind for later on that I want to ask now. And that is, I saw in your bio, in your professional bio, you have a full sentence saying, I am the daughter of Jewish Holocaust survivors, and I grew up in a tight community of Holocaust survivors. And I'm thinking about the environment today. Do you ever worry that your writing is so focused on being obviously Jewish? Do you ever consider removing that sentence from, let's say, a grant application bio?
Well,
Are there times when you feel like it's not going to help you for people to know this about you? And it's a question we all have to ask at this point. What are your thoughts on that?
yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I think it's a great question again, and thank you for asking it. I I think there were times I was concerned that people categorized me, but I learned to embrace the categorization of being a Jewish poet or a Jewish American poet. And I'm Canadian. I'm Canadian. I'm Canadian and American, and and Jewish. And at first, I mean, I was fine about it at the beginning, and I think I've always been a quite. I don't know. I don't think I was concerned or upset about it. I think I was proud of it.
Yeah.
And there were moments where I think none of us want to be categorized all that much, but now I was happy about it, and I embrace it now, and I especially am. I mean, of course, I'm proud of it, and also since October 7th, it's taken on a whole new meaning because it's really become in my experience, my own, and being on the board of Yetzirah, which is an organization that is made up of Jewish poets and for people who want to read Jewish poetry. So I'm the secretary on the board of that organization, and so I've heard a lot of stories since October 7th, and it's been harder to be a Jewish poet and writer since October.
Yes, yes, it has.
So There are people who are nervous about expressing their Judaism, but I have learned to embrace it, and I feel the more anti-Semitic I feel our culture becomes, the more I want to make sure that I embrace my Judaism.
I find myself wanting to scream it out from the rooftops. I feel very like they got me going. Like, okay, I'm proud. And by the way, this is what a Jew is, and this is what a Jew looks like, and
Right.
this is how a Jew writes and thinks. And by the way, she looks and thinks a lot like your sister, but I have other questions. I have different kinds of questions than your sister might have. That's all. Yeah, and but I get, I'm really going, I'm going whole hog into that. My most recent book is Daughters of Eve, which is a book of Midrash. It's a book of essays that simply asks a lot of questions about the women of the Bible, because I get very annoyed at the Bible, at the Tanakh, at how women are portrayed and how they've been interpreted through the years to try to limit us. And my editors turned it into a discussion workbook and journaling guide, which is like, because I ask so many questions. So it's like, hey, out there, this is who I am. But this is about you. I apologize about that. Could you share a bit about your writing and editing process? How do you approach a poem, or does it approach you and then you have to tackle it? How do you go about writing a book-length elegy of poetry? How long did that take?
Let's see. It evolved over time. So the initial draft probably only took a couple of years, but I put it away for a long time because I was a little unsure if it was ethically, morally all right for me to take on my aunt's experience, because there's no way I can possibly, of course, know what that was like to live during the Holocaust, and let alone be an actual, as Elie Wiesel said, the actual witnesses are the people who perished.
Yes.
But then, so I would say, like, I had a draft by maybe 2012, and then I put it away till 2019 because I was very uncertain of it, and I worked on something else. And then with the emergence of white supremacism and the atmosphere being so full of like hate for the other, I decided, no, it was better to bring it back out again.
Yeah.
And so, it got published in 2022, and I would say and it got accepted, I think, in 2020, and I worked on it till it went to the printer, basically,
Yeah.
I really believe in revision. I love revising, and I know it's something like people can shy away from, but to me, it's one of the richest aspects of writing.
Yes.
So, I revise a lot, and sometimes a poem does come to me, and other times I sit down and I just start working, and it comes. Usually it's a surprise. Like, I might have, I usually have a bit of an idea of what I might want to tackle, and of course it changes because it does the poem does what it wants to do in some ways. That's when in the process of revision, one can then maybe mold it more, or like work on the formal aspects, stylistic aspects. So,
when you have a theme, you had the theme of your Aunt Bird, and her experience. Did you have a poetic form that you had in mind, that you tried to shape it to, or did the words come out of you naturally because you know the form so intimately that it just came out of you as whatever form it needed to be?
Yeah, another good question. Both. I think what happened was, so I wrote it poem by poem, and then of course did a lot of revising. But yeah, like for example, one of the earlier poems, it's too long to read. It's called Bird Conjured. It's made up of, I think, 5 sections. And I knew I wanted to use prose in it, like write prose poems, because there was a lot of information being conveyed about what the ghetto was like and some of the statistics. So I knew at times, I'm going to write a book that's hybrid. There are also lyric essays in the book.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. So, and then though, when I would write the poems, where I wasn't sure if it was, when I was less sure about form, I often let them have their own way with me, like they just did what they were going to do. But then, in the revision process, I of course, ultimately, one does, I think poets usually do make very rigorous decisions about it. So the lines would be long and short, and I thought, do I want that? Like, that seems erratic. But then there was something about, I decided that the long and short showed a sort of the uncertainty I had in terms of her life, or it represented certain formal decisions that I thought made sense with work, like the sort of zigzagging of the mind or something.
Yes.
Because
Very
I can be a
good.
very tight poet, but like my work can be very tight, and it is. I worked, I work on every word, but but I let many of the poems I let lines be quite long, then shorter, then long, then shorter, because the movement of the mind about the entire
Yes.
experience.
Yeah. And actually, the length of the line can very much convey the emotion and the
Yeah,
meaning so fully, just as
exactly.
words can. The rhythm conveys it so fully, also.
Yes, exactly. Oh no, the rhythm is for me. Because I was a visual artist first, imagery in terms of the sense of sight is very
Mhm.
important. But
Yes.
I don't know, I think it's having my experience of studying, just studying with rabbis and the liturgy and, just the rhythms of davening and of
Mhm.
prayer,
Yes. Yes.
I'm very dominated by those. Like they really resonate for me.
For those who don't know, davening is actually the movement when people are praying into the rhythm of the words, and it is almost an ecstatic experience because you're floating through the words.
Beautiful. Yeah,
Yes.
that's so lovely how you said
Yeah.
that. And it's exactly right. And yeah, I think that my upbringing as a Jew and the rhythms of prayer are very, very resonant for me. They're just
Yes.
in my body.
Yes, absolutely. Now, you also do, I read a beautiful essay of yours yesterday about portraits,
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and which is just beautiful. And I'm wondering, how does your poetry and first of all, is your process in essays similar to your process with poetry, or are they two divergent ways of expressing yourself?
That's a good question too. They feed each other,
Yes.
they nurture each other, and I feel they affect one another.
Mhm.
I think in my essay writing, I'm very, like as I am with my poetry, I'm very focused on every word, and I'm very focused, the way I am in poetry, focused on the line and where the line breaks.
Mhm.
In essays, I'm very focused on sentences
Yes. Yes.
and how the sentence reads. So they do inform one another, and of course, it's slightly. I mean, yeah, they're not that different for me. I feel like I use my whole body to write both,
Hmm. Hmm. What do you
So
mean by you use your whole body? What is that experience like?
I was talking, it's a good question too. Like I was talking to a group of students the other day, and I said the important, for me, poetry and I think all literature has a rhythm to it.
Hmm.
And we don't, and I'll go back to poetry for a second because, you know, kids are really, and not just kids, people are afraid of poetry often just because of the way it's been taught. Like it's, you're supposed to uncover these mysteries. And for me, it's really, no, I tell people just enjoy the music, the rhythm, as you said with the prayer, like the almost ecstatic experience of it.
Yeah.
And I know poets who walk in order to compose, because I feel like it's so much part the way we write poetry, and this might be a little different from some prose, certainly from a newspaper article like journalism maybe, but I'm not even sure because I can't, I'm sure everyone has their different feelings about this, but I really think poets sense language in their bodies, with their hearts, with their limbs, with their, with their with their minds, with their psyches, with their, just in their fingers and their hands. It's very physical.
Yes. Yes.
It should be enjoyed that, like, no one, the beauty of literature for me is that we reread it and we get different things from it. Make peace with time, because we change, it changes for us too. So initially, anybody can enjoy a poem just listening or reading it, and hearing the music of it, or listening to a poet read it and just enjoying the music.
Yes. Now, I'm also a visual artist, but it's more photographic, and I find my mind sees things that I have to explain. I have to make other people see. But you have a master's degree and a PhD in writing and literature, but you started out, your bachelor's degree and MFA was in painting.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how does your art relate to your poetry? Are there rhythms in your art that you see that came out later in your poetry? Or is it doing something for you, for your inner self, that both do, or you need it to have both?
Yeah, I think I always loved literature and I always loved art as a kid.
Yeah.
I think because Yiddish was my first language, I was insecure about, could I really be a writer, in English? I was insecure about it. So once I decided, I love art, I love painting, I love these kind of big projects I would take on, but I needed something that was concrete yet ephemeral. And I had written some art criticism, so I had an affinity with words. I thought, and at least I felt that I had a real attachment to words. And basically, it felt to me, they're very similar, painting and writing poems.
Yes. Yes.
They're very similar, like it's sort of assembling things or, moving things around, and they're quite similar. I think that language just started to be more of my medium with time. Like I only started writing poems when I was 38.
Oh.
So
Okay.
I think I just felt I needed that transition. It just made sense to me, Yeah.
Now, you have been sharing a picture that I'm very curious about. And if you don't mind, I'm going to share the screen so people can see the one that you've been sharing, because I'd like you to tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, well, I did. Thank you for showing it, displaying it. I did that. I made that drawing. It's a drawing, essentially. It's a drawing.
Yes.
And I made it when I was in doing my BFA college. I did my BFA at a school called Concordia University in Montreal, and then I did my MFA at Columbia here in New York.
Right.
And yeah, it was. It would just sort of came. I guess what I had done was I did a sketch of a model in the context of the art studio at the college, and then I elaborated on it because I felt so attached to the emotion, or what I imagined was the emotion of the subject of the woman in the drawing. But then I didn't look at my work for a while, like the work I did in college. Of course, my mother saved everything, but and then And then when I took things out of storage, I saw this drawing in one of my portfolios, and I thought, God, I don't even remember it. And then I did suddenly remember it. And when I used to have my book cover on my, I'd have it displayed on my emails as sort of part of my signature. But when October 7th happened, this became my signature.
That's very interesting. I was wondering if it had to do with your own emotions, and clearly it did.
Yes.
You saw yourself in it. It's for such a young person, it's a very evocative drawing,
Yeah,
and
thank you.
like your words, it is very evocative.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Now you had mentioned Yetzirah. That's how I met you. Was I believe first at the table, and then at the lovely Friday evening event when you read. I was so impressed. I did join. I'm not officially a poet. I'm a proserist, but it's
All are welcome.
but I'm a closet poet. But can you tell us a bit about Yetzirah? Because I think some of our audience might be very interested in learning about it. It's spelled Yetzirah, for those of you who want to find it. And it's the subtitle is A Hearth for Jewish Poetry, which is a very warm way of looking at it. Tell us a bit about it, if you could, please.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about it. It is definitely based on the genius of the executive director, Jessica Jacobs, who's an amazing poet. She has a new book that just came out, also from my press, Four-Way Books, and it's called Unalone, and it engages with Genesis. And she has worked. So Jessica Jacobs, she's done an immense amount of work to make this organization for Jewish poets and Jewish poetry come to life. And we have a wonderful board also, Jean Dubrow, who's an amazing poet and essayist. She's also one of the major people on the board, and Rick Chess and Maya Bernstein. And together we try to come up with different programs. There's a book club, there are readings, there's a website. We could probably maybe in some way find a way to give the audience that website. It's a really important, and it is dedicated to Jewish poets. As I said, we have a database of Jewish poets, and we keep adding, people add themselves. There are criteria, and we have, what we're working on at the moment. We had our first summer conference last summer at the University of North Carolina at Asheville, and through their Jewish Studies program. And we're having our second conference this year from July 1st to July 7th. And we were just going through manuscripts to pick different categories of, we have like contributors, we have scholars, we have fellows, we have an amazing faculty. Last year we had an amazing faculty too. And we also have the opportunity this year for people who want to come off site. So you can check.
What is the purpose of the conference? What do people do there?
So it's a lot like based on Breadloaf and Swanee and other writers conferences. It's the writing workshops at Yetzirah are generative, which means they help to generate work rather than focus on a finished product. And that way, different levels of poets, like someone at the beginning of their writing experience and career, and someone who's got several books, can all be in a workshop together. We all sit in on the workshops. And it's last summer when we had the conference. I mean, if you go to the website, you can see some of the reactions. It was like it was magical. There were 36 of participants, and I think anyone who questioned the need for a Jewish literary organization and then came to the conference, stopped questioning the need. And I think now after October 7th,
Yeah.
we're not questioning it either. But people wonder, we've been so integrated into American culture. But no, people were so hungry for it.
Yes.
It's magical, the whole organization. And that's so much thanks to Jessica Jacobs.
Yes. Well, I just looked up the website just to make sure I had it correctly. It's yetzirapoets.org. So it's YETZIRAH poets, no space.org. Is that correct?
Yes,
So,
that sounds right.
And from my small experience at AWP, interacting with the folks from Yetzirah, you feel so at home. That's why calling it a hearth for Jewish poetry is. I felt it like part of something that was warm and Hamisha. It was just.
Yeah, exactly.
It just felt really good. Now, please give a definition of Hamisha, because I know the feeling of it, but you're the Yiddish speaker.
Yeah, Hamish, it means sort of the warm sense of being at. You said it right. It's homemade, things that are homemade and warm. The warmth of home, basically. You know, the comfort and warmth one feels at home. So home-like, yeah.
Yeah, it really felt wonderful, especially in that environment. Now, just as a last thing to ask, you're a teacher as well.
Yes.
So you're dealing with a lot of poets who are at various levels. I understand you're also doing private mentoring at this point. What's one of the more important bits of advice that you offer your poet students? Do you have one that you love, that you feel just is a good general one?
I would say first, there are two parts to it. One is read and read and read and read as much poetry and everything, really, you know. But of course, if you're writing poetry, you want to know about other poets. So read the past, read current things, you know, and then read all kinds of literature. And the other thing is just then try to be true to your own vision.
Yeah. That's true of all writing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And art.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And it evolves. One's vision does evolve, but, you know, stay close to your heart.
One would hope it would evolve. Otherwise, you don't want to be doing the same thing every day.
No, I think it's an adventure. And I think the other thing I would say to people is just let it surprise you, let it teach you, let
Marvelous. Well, that's a wonderful advice. I love it. Thank you, Yerra. It's been delightful talking with you. I hope we will have many conversations as we move along. My guest today was poet Yerra Sugarman. Her books are Aunt Bird, which is the newest, The Bag of Broken Glass, and Forms of Gone. You can connect with her on her website, yerrasugarman.com, and the next slide will have the spelling, and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. As for me, my two newest books are Of Being Woman, a collection of feminist science fiction from Noble Fusion Press, and Daughters of Eve from Bait Publishing, which is an essay-based workbook and journaling guide for exploring the nature of our lives today through the lens of the stories of the women of the Hebrew Bible, such as Eve, Rebecca, Deborah, and such. My website and blog are Sally Wiener Grotta. My videos are on YouTube, and you can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and sometimes on Blue Sky. I'm trying to get that going. Maybe someday Substack if I ever figure it out. Thank you, Yerra, for being with me, and it felt very warm and wonderful to be in your home for a few minutes.
Oh, same. I love being with you too, Sally. Thank you so much. Be well.
You too.